Hello, my friends, and everyone interested in this ancient text called the Bible and the book of Exodus. We are going through chapters 11 and 12, where we're going to discover that there's something much more significant about this final plague than just what's written on the paper. And we're going to have to wrestle with this number of Israelites who leave the land of Egypt, because early when we started the book of Exodus, we said that scholars estimate that it might be like between 2 and 3 million. And we're going to have to kind of wrestle with, is that a literal number? Is it figurative? Is the writer of this book even trustworthy with these numbers and figures? Yeah, the Bible's about to get real. We might get a little bit colorful, so buckle up and welcome to Dumb Christian. Okay, we have had 9 plagues up to this point, and Egypt, the whole land of Egypt, is in terror. As far as they know, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has killed all of their gods, undermined their entire Egyptian way of life, their culture, their religion. Everything that they've grown accustomed to and held dear is just thrown out the window. And they're wondering, what is left? What do we do next? The only thing that they have as like this last bastion of hope is the fact that Pharaoh is still alive. And remember, Pharaoh is supposed to be the god incarnate, Horus. And I think before I mentioned that he's supposed to be Pharaoh or Ra incarnate, it's a little bit tricky. Egyptian theology gets a little dicey, but I guess he's Horus, Ra's son. But then his eye is Ra, and it gets weird and confusing. But he's supposed to be the god, the top god, the top dog god in the flesh. And so they're wondering, what is Pharaoh gonna do now? Because he is the last remnant of the gods for this people group. And God tells Moses there's going to be one final plague. This is going to be the last one, because Pharaoh will actually let you guys go after this plague. This plague is the death of the firstborn of every family, of all the humans and all the animals. Every firstborn. And we're going to unpack that. Don't worry. So God tells Moses, this is what's going to go down. Go tell the Israelites to get ready. Put on your running shoes, do your warm-up stretches, and go ask the Egyptians for silver and gold. Remember, God said, I'm going to have you plunder the Egyptians without like wiping them out, right? Like it's this weird experience of plundering the Egyptians where they're just going to say, hey, give us gold and silver, and the Egyptians are like, yeah, okay, here, take it. Take whatever you want out of my house. I don't want to mess with you guys. Your God is real and legit. I don't want, to take it. Whatever you want, take it. Ask the Egyptians for traveling money, if you will. And the Egyptians have grown to like revere Moses. They used to look at Pharaoh as the God incarnate in flesh, but Moses is actually like behaving in the way that they would have expected Pharaoh to behave. Moses says this is what's going to happen by the God of the Israelites, and it happens. So Moses kind of has become, in a lot of ways, Pharaoh to these people, and they revere him, they fear him, they favor the Israelites. They say, wow, this God, this people, they worship the true God, the real God. They know what's going down. And this gets a little bit tricky when it comes time. The next section says that Moses said this to Pharaoh. But if we remember in the last chapter, chapter 10, Pharaoh says, get out of my presence. If I ever see you again, I will kill you. So, okay, did Moses go back into Pharaoh's presence and he just didn't get killed, or what's going on here? And the Hebrew here can be translated, Moses had already told Pharaoh. So that's what we're going to go with. Moses had already had this conversation with Pharaoh. He said, look, the plague is going to be locust and then darkness, and if you still don't let us go, he had already told Pharaoh, then this is what's going to happen. The firstborn of every family and animal is going to be killed. And this has been a mercy, because God could have wiped you out by now. He could have killed everybody. but it's a mercy that he's revealing himself so that you know who he is, and you still have your life. Remember, God's trying to teach Pharaoh a lesson, and the Egyptians and the whole world at this time, that Pharaoh isn't God. God is God. And Moses leaves Pharaoh's presence pretty hot-headed, kind of pissed off, because he's like, what's it going to take for this guy to pull his head out of his ass? He's going to kill me the next time he sees me? And Moses is just kind of like frustrated, because why won't this guy see what he's doing? Why can't he see the damage he's causing his own people? And then God gives Moses details about what's going to happen. He says, okay, this is going to be a Passover. And there's two primary things that happen tonight during the Passover. The first is, it is the actual Passover takes place. The angel of the Lord passes over the houses that have lamb's blood painted on the doorposts, which we're going to get to, and then goes and judges the houses that don't have lamb's blood. And God made it very clear. He says, I'm going to execute my judgment on the gods of Egypt. Now, we know Scripture unpacks this for us. It's not that there's a bunch of gods and Yahweh is one of them, and he's kind of like vying for position over the other gods. No. The gods of Egypt and all the other nations are actually like angels and other spiritual beings that God created as a part of his family, who rebelled against God when he created humans to be a part of his family. And so these spiritual beings in rebellion, who led human beings into rebellion as well, became worshipped as gods. And God says, I am going to execute judgment on the gods of Egypt by passing over the houses that have lamb's blood on the doorposts and killing the firstborn in the houses and farms where there is no lamb's blood. And this is going to have major, significant impact on the last spark of hope that Egypt has for themselves. The second thing that's going to happen is that the way that they're going to prepare for the Passover, as well as the subsequent Exodus, the dismissal from Egypt, is the way that they're going to each year reenact what they did to prepare for God's deliverance, his salvation. Another thing that's going to happen here is the start of the Israelite religious calendar. They already have an agricultural calendar. And we know this from some scholarly research and other places in the Bible, but in essence, they've been either using their Egyptian agricultural calendar, or they've had their own that they brought with them when Jacob and his whole tribe came. But now they have the start of a religious calendar. And there's a lot of festivals and stuff that go on here, but the first one starts here with this one, Passover. It becomes like this trademark festival, a celebration that they're going to celebrate for several millennia to come. Okay, so the way that this night is about to unfold and the subsequent reenactment of this night each year as they celebrate and remember God's deliverance from Egypt with this Passover, is each family, each household needs to take a perfect lamb. And when I think of lamb, I think of like a sheep, right? But according to that ancient custom, it could be a sheep or a goat, but it's a lamb. It's like a young sheep or goat, no older than 1 year old, no younger than 1 year old. Got to be 1 year old, pretty much. But it has to be perfect. No blemishes, can't be sick, no broken bones, the ear can't be clipped. Like, it has to be a perfect lamb, sheep or goat. And what you're going to do, God tells Moses, is you're going to, each family, and it's, so each household or there's a certain number of people, because if it's just you and your wife and you don't have any kids, right, you don't need to do a whole lamb, but you kind of partner up and you group up in groups of 10 or something, okay. And you take one lamb, and what you're going to do is, as the sun sets, you're going to sacrifice this lamb. Typically what they would do is, warning, a little bit of graphic content here. They would take a very sharp flint stone knife and cut an artery, and they would drain the blood's animal, trying to do it as humanely as possible, quickly and painlessly, if possible. But the catch is here, you can't just spill the blood on the ground. You need to catch it in a basin. So you'd catch the blood in a basin, the animal would die. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take hyssop, which is a common plant in that area. You're going to get a bunch of hyssop and you're going to use it like a paintbrush. And you're going to dip the hyssop in the basin of blood, and you're going to paint the door frame, the two sides and the lintel, which is the top frame of the door. The sides and the top, you're going to paint with lamb's blood from this perfect sacrifice. Then what you're going to do is you're going to roast the whole lamb, like a spit roast, and you're going to like slowly rotate it over the fire, right? And you're going to eat the whole lamb. That's why they want to like group up in groups of however many, and they say, okay, because we can't let any go to waste. So you're going to eat the lamb. There's also some other things that, some unleavened bread, which we're going to have to get into a little bit later. It's already part of their their Israelite custom and heritage. They have some festivals and traditions surrounding unleavened bread, but tonight it's very specific. Unleavened bread, which means there's no yeast in it. It hasn't had time to rise up and fluff up like a big loaf of bread you get from the grocery store. This is going to be like a flat bread, because yeast takes time to ferment. That bacteria takes some time to like grow and expand, right? So unleavened bread, lamb, roasted. And this is a weird note. He says specifically it can't be boiled and it can't be fried or something else like this, but it's got to be roasted. And then after you're done eating, clean up, pack up, and get ready to boot, scoot, and boogie, because what's going to happen is the angel of the Lord is going to come down to the land of Egypt. And he is going to survey every single house. And any house where the entrance doorway is not painted in the blood of the lamb is going to experience the wrath, the judgment of God, the judgment of Yahweh God against the gods of Egypt and the people who follow these gods in direct rebellion against Yahweh God. But he will pass over any house whose doorway is painted in the lamb's blood. Now, this is interesting because we're going to have to take a step back and say, well, who's actually doing the judgment? Who's killing people? Because here the language says that it's the angel of the Lord. But several times in Psalms and elsewhere in the Bible, it says that Yahweh God himself is the one who killed the firstborn. And we need to understand the Bible was written in a very particular type of language and in a culture where they understood what they meant when they wrote it, that this is a physical version of Yahweh God. The second person, we've actually talked about this. Go check out Did Jesus Claim to Be God? Because we unpack that in an Old Testament way. It's really cool. But again, here is the physical manifestation, the representation of God in matter, and it's described as the angel of the Lord. We see several times, right? Even in the burning bush, the angel of the Lord. Elsewhere, the ancient understanding was that this was the second person of God, the one who has a physical form. And Passover is actually an interesting thing that we need to take a second to unpack, because the word Passover actually comes from the Latin translation, which was in around like between the 450 AD or BCE, depending on how you phrase our current dating system. And during the time of Rome, when Christianity became an institution, when it became state, like organized and run by the state, and it was translated Passover. And so a lot of times when you will look up if you go to like an interlinear or a original language, here the Hebrew Pesach is going to most frequently translate Passover. But the ancient understanding of this word Pesach actually means protective sacrifice. And people much smarter than me have done the scholarly work to figure it out. I'm just using their information. Sources are in the description below. But Pesach means a protective sacrifice, because what's happening here, yes, it's fair and it's a very legitimate translation to say that the angel of the Lord passed over, but it's because the blood from this perfect lamb protected those within the house from the judgment of God's wrath against rebellion. Right? The gods are in rebellion. The gods of Egypt, the people of Egypt. Pharaoh himself led the people in rebellion against Yahweh. And this blood protects the people inside. And so this is actually where we get the idea that the sacrificial lamb is necessary to protect the people from the wrath of God. And why Paul later in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, is actually going to call Jesus the perfect sacrificial Passover lamb. This is where that comes from, because many times it's viewed as, oh, it's just like an indicator, a marker. It's a signpost that says, hey, we're okay, God, we belong to the Israelites. But that's not what the original ancient understanding was. No, this is a protective sacrifice. So the angel of the Lord is going to come. Here's how the evening plays out. The sun is beginning to set, and all of Egypt is quiet, waiting with bated breath. What is going to happen? Parents are holding their children. And across the way, over the Nile, in the land of Goshen, they can hear the faint cries of goats and lambs being led to sacrifice. And as the sun sets a bit more, that noise begins to fade out because each of the sacrificial lambs has been killed. The blood is now being painted on the doorposts, and silence falls across the land. Within the land of Goshen, among the Israelites, you can hear the crackling of the fire as the lambs are fully roasted, carefully, gently, patiently. And then families gather within their homes. They put out the fires. The land goes dark. By candlelight, families eat the roasted lamb, unleavened bread. Once they finished, they cleaned everything up, put the dishes away. They packed those things that they were ready to take with them, and they waited. Midnight approaches. The whole land is quiet. And then all of a sudden, someone hears a scream down the street in the land of Egypt. And then a house closer, another scream. Next door, a scream. And in their house, they discover themselves. Someone has died. And the whole land of Egypt is wrecked when the angel of the Lord, Yahweh himself, the second person, has gone through every single home and killed the firstborn of every man, woman, child, or beast whose house did not have lamb's blood on the doorpost. And the Bible says there wasn't a house in Egypt that wasn't affected by this death. Now the Egyptians are wrecked. The firstborn of every family has died. On the surface, this seems like a really strong-handed move, right? Like, oh, that just demonstrates God's power. He's able to identify which is the firstborn. Like, maybe we can just take a step back and say, I can see how this would be enough to get Pharaoh to say, okay, get out of here. But what we need to understand is that Pharaoh himself is this last remaining pillar of the society of Egypt. And when a pharaoh dies, there is this, it's a very significant event and process. Yes, the body needs to be consecrated, needs to be taken care of in a holy way, and then, buried and all these things. But immediately they need to bring it back into power the next pharaoh. So there's a particular way that you mourn the loss of Pharaoh, but immediately his firstborn son needs to be established as the next pharaoh, Horus incarnate, right? to maintain the divine balance, the cosmic order of all things. But what just happened was there is no next Pharaoh. Every last remnant of Egyptian culture, theology, hope has just been eliminated. What are we going to do? And Pharaoh says, get the hell out of here. I don't ever want to see you again. Leave. And the Egyptians join him, right? They're like, whatever it takes, take everything. Just get out of here. We can't be in your presence anymore. So they take their unleavened bread, right? They had some baked. They also take some dough because they don't have time to let it rise. That was part of the very specific instructions. Don't put leaven in your bread. Don't try to cultivate yeast or fermentation, because God's deliverance is immediate and complete. You know, he's warning them. You don't just get to sit around and say, "Oh God, I'm really excited for this deliverance, but just give me a little bit. I'm almost ready. I love what you're about to do, but can you just hold off for a little bit?" God says, no. It's happening now. And this is part of your provision, that you'll have bread, but it won't be leavened. Another interesting note is that this deliverance, this immediate deliverance, came at night. And there's some weird relevance and connection with the way that Jesus tells parables about how things are going to be at the very end when he comes back. There's something about night, right? Where it's, you better be ready. There is no, oh God, great, that sounds cool. Just could you hold off a little bit longer? Now, there is something significant, I think, for us to understand, that his deliverance from this salvation, the oppression of abusive people, abusive gods in Egypt, is immediate. His deliverance is immediate. But there is a process when they come to the promised land about inheriting, walking into it, and living within the promised land. That occurs over the course of a process. So there is something a little different there. We're not going to try and unpack it. You know, what's the symbolism here? What does it mean? I'll let you kind of sort through it and figure it out. But his deliverance is immediate, but the walking into the promised land is a little bit of a promise. And then the author here says that Israel lived in Egypt for 430 years. Now, the Jewish traditions and the Midrash, the rabbis, they say Israel only lived in Egypt for 100 and some years. And they kind of do some math with when God said it, and they kind of have some footwork to explain why. But the Bible says they were in Egypt for 430 years. At Dumb Christian, that's what we're going to go with. And then there's this really odd note that the author interjects in here. And he says, when you celebrate this, so it's there's this kind of gloom and doom, this terror of the night. God has gone through, and there's a bunch of death, and there's a bunch of mourning and sorrow and weeping and wailing. And then in the middle of it, he says, oh, by the way, when you celebrate this, next year and in the years to come. So it's just kind of a weird interjection, but I guess it fits because that's, he's explaining what's happening. He says, you can't have foreign guests. The only people who are allowed to celebrate what God did here as deliverance and salvation are Israelites. Now, there is a caveat where God says, yeah, if anyone wants to join the Israelite nation and become an Israelite, yeah, we can definitely do that. We just need to make the distinction that this isn't just for anybody and everybody. Again, we're not going to try and unpack what all that means, symbolism. You can figure that out yourself, wrestle with it. But it is interesting that he says not just anyone can participate of the Passover celebration, because in the very next section, he says there's a mixed multitude that went out with them. This idea that it's not just the Israelites, but there are a handful of Egyptians who said, we want to join you. We want to be a part of your nation. This people group who are protected and loved by this Yahweh God, because he's the real God. We've seen him at work. We want to join you guys. There's this mixed multitude. that now believe God is real. Oh, but then we get into something a little bit tricky, because it says that 600,000 men and women and children left Egypt. Not just the men, women, and children, but also all the livestock and animals that go along with this number. At the beginning of Exodus, we mentioned that some scholars do the math and they think, well, it could be between 2 and 3 million people plus all of their livestock. And you know, they mention a bunch of different animals that come with them. And this is going to be a problem. How do we handle this? Because geographically, practically, and mathematically, when we walk through where Israel went, how long it took them to get from place to place, how much space they occupied, 2 to 3 million doesn't really make sense from our modern Western perspective. So what's happening here? We need to remember, again, that the Bible wasn't written to us, to our modern way of thinking. It was written in a time, a culture, where a particular way of writing about military conquests was universally accepted and expected when describing an accurate historical account of what happened. The events occurred. Here is what happened, when it happened, how it happened. But when a military event addresses the numbers of people involved, the numbers of people slain, or the number of people who obtained victory, the numbers actually are intended to reflect the grandness of the scale of the victory, not necessarily a literal number of people involved. And this is true for any of the number of the other historical cultures going on at the time, Sumerian, Babylonian, right? When you look, when historians and scholars look at those writings, it's understood what they're doing in their effort to accurately convey what happened historically. Not that these are the literal numbers, but this is the scale on which the event occurred. It was massive. 2 to 3 million? That's unheard of. And this is an event that sent shockwaves throughout the earth at that time. Even generations later, the other tribes in the world are still talking about what happened in Egypt. And the way that this is recorded might actually not sit well in our Western mindset, because hang on, that if those numbers weren't literal, then I can't expect the rest of this account to be literal and serious, and I can't take it seriously. But I can't help but wonder if recognizing that the time at which this was written and the way that it actually did accurately record according to that custom and that culture's way of expecting a historically accurate account to be written almost gives it more credence to understand that, look, they were legitimately conveying this is what really happened. But each one of us are going to have to kind of wrestle with that, right? I'm just trying to be a dumb Christian to help us figure this out. What's written there? We're just trying to let the Bible be what it is. That's the Bible. That's Exodus chapters 11 and 12. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this little section of the journey. We're going to get into some major parts of the Exodus next time, as Pharaoh kind of regrets his decision. But if you guys have appreciated this content, check out the sources and the links below, because they're where I'm getting some of my confusing, or maybe where'd you get that piece of information from? Be sure to subscribe, hit like, share this with your friends and family so we don't go on this journey alone. And I'll catch you in the next one. I love you guys.